In the deep winter of 1897, a small notice appeared in the Springfield Republican. It was easy to miss just a few quiet lines about the sudden passing of a woman named Margaret Dale in remote Tenney County, Missouri. The obituary called her nothing more than a devoted mother of 2 daughters survived by her husband Elias. No details, no whispers of what her absence would leave behind. No hint at the shadow that would stretch across generations. Yet, the county burial records preserved in the nearby town of Forsyth tell a quieter, stranger story. Margaret's grave was marked only by a simple wooden cross. The inscription wore away within a few seasons, as if time itself wished to erase her name. A family already broken by loss became isolated in grief and in memory. This death so plain on paper was the spark that began it all. Before we drift further into this dark valley of the past, take a slow breath with me. If you haven't already, press the like button and subscribe so you never miss the darkest histories hidden in plain sight. And if you feel like sharing, write in the comments where you're watching from and what hour of the night keeps you awake. It's a small way of reminding one another that no matter the distance, we listen to these stories together. Now, back to Tenney County. The Dowell homestead stood lonely on a windswept ridge far from town, a weather-beaten house overlooking fields that had long since surrendered their harvest. Neighbors remembered that after Margaret's passing, the shutters stayed drawn and the sound of voices rarely escaped those walls. The sisters, once seen walking to the one-room schoolhouse, hand in hand with their mother, vanished from the attendance rolls that same spring. Their names, Eliza and Clara, appear no further in the district ledgers. Elias claimed he would teach them himself, but no evidence of lessons was ever found. The church too lost sight of the family. Records kept by the Tenney County Historical Society show that the Dowell's pew went empty, their names absent from baptismal and communion books after 1897. In a rural community where faith and farming bound families together, such sudden withdrawal was more than unusual. It was alarming. Some neighbors murmured that it was grief. Others suspected a darker pride. One neighbor's diary put it simply: the Dowells closed their house and their hearts. No one dared question what went on behind those shuttered windows. The land itself deepened the isolation. Winters in the Ozarks could be cruel. The ridge roads buried after storms, leaving the house cut off for weeks. When Elias did appear in town to trade, he came alone. His daughters' faces were never seen. Locals whispered that pale figures moved only by lamplight inside the house, glimpsed, if at all, in the wavering glow through frosted glass. Without their mother's presence, the sisters seemed bound entirely to the will of their father. To understand the horror that would later unfold, one must see this silence not as mere absence, but as the soil in which darker truths would take root. From the moment of Margaret Dowell's death onward, the record shows a family that deliberately severed itself from the outside world. But what those public records cannot tell, and what later investigators would piece together from scattered affidavits, coroner's notes, and the yellowed ledgers of the county almshouse, is that Margaret's death was not the end of the Dowell story. It was, in fact, the beginning of one of the most disturbing family histories in the Ozarks, a history that officials would one day call the most inbred bloodline ever documented in this county. The United States Census of 1900 lists Elias Dowell as a widower. 45 years old head of household with 2 daughters still under his roof. No occupation is given beyond farmer, though by then his land had grown thin and unyielding. The bare notations on the census form reveal almost nothing until they are read beside the recollections of neighbors and the brittle parish minutes of Forsyth Baptist Church. From these fragments, a picture of a man begins to emerge, stern, secretive, jealous of his authority. Townsmen remembered Elias as a figure who spoke little, his presence marked by the heavy silence that followed him into stores and taverns. A diary kept by John Wainwright, the local storekeeper, notes that Elias did not suffer inquiry into his affairs. When asked after his daughters, he answered only, "They are well enough," and turned the subject with a cold glance. On Sundays, where once Margaret had led the girls by hand into the church pew, Elias appeared alone. He muttered that grief was a private thing and offered no further explanation. It was in this atmosphere that whispers began to grow. Farmers traveling the ridge road claimed they heard voices in the night. Not joyous, not sorrowful, but strange, urgent, sometimes muffled by weeping. A sheriff's deputy years later would write that rumors of unnatural domestic practices were already circulating by the summer of 1901. And so the story deepens, layer by layer, like frost settling over a lonely grave. What happened within that house on the ridge? What truths were hidden behind drawn shutters and fading census ink? As we continue, keep listening, because sometimes the quietest families leave behind the loudest ghosts. Though no complaint was ever formally recorded in the quiet hills of rural Missouri, where family honor was guarded with a silence as sharp as winter air, the line between suspicion and evidence remained wide and dangerously blurred. The daughters themselves became figures of restless speculation. They were seen only rarely, and when a rare sighting occurred, their eyes stayed cast downward. Their movements hesitant and strange, as though the very sunlight was foreign to them. A school teacher from a neighboring district, writing decades later in a private memoir, recalled glimpsing two pale girls on the ridge path, walking as though in perfect lockstep, their faces alike as mirror images. He noted the oddity that no man ever courted them, and that Elias never sought suitors, though both girls had quietly passed into womanhood. After the turn of the century, the isolation only deepened. Elias's farm failed, the once fertile soil worn thin, yet he refused every offer of assistance. When creditors pressed him, he bartered with livestock, never with coin. The daughters remained hidden, their presence betrayed only by faint candlelight shimmering behind shuttered windows on moonless nights. To those looking in from the outside, it seemed as though the Dowell household had turned inward completely, a small world unto itself, bound by a secret gravity no neighbor dared disturb. Later, investigators studying scattered papers from this bleak span of years would conclude that it was during this very time between Margaret's burial and the first whispers of pregnancy that the foundation of the Dowell tragedy was laid. For the community, it was merely an odd family withdrawing into grief and pride. For the sisters, as later records quietly imply, it was the beginning of something darker, a life confined to their father's will, where silence became law, and where children would soon be born carrying the unmistakable mark of blood that should never have mixed. By the spring of 1902, the names of Eliza and Clara Dowell had disappeared from every public ledger in Tenney County. The schoolhouse register lists their attendance up to the year of their mother's death, then stops abruptly. Parish books too record no confirmations, no marriages, no communions. In a community where even the poorest families left some record of their children's passage into adulthood, the silence surrounding the Dowell sisters was glaring, like a missing page torn from a Bible. The first outsider to remark on their absence was Reverend Amos Carter, who noted in his quarterly report to the Baptist Association that Brother Dowell has not permitted his daughters to partake in services for some years, a matter of increasing concern. His note was filed away among routine correspondence, forgotten until unearthed decades later in denominational archives. At the time, it raised no alarm. Rural Missouri was a place where grief often justified eccentricity, and neighbors seldom pressed into private sorrow. And yet, small irregularities began to surface. In the autumn of 1903, a midwife named Sarah Fields recorded in her ledger a nighttime summons to the Dowell homestead. She later testified that she was turned away at the door by Elias himself, who told her curtly that the matter was already tended to. Still in her neat script, she penciled a single haunting line: "Child delivered weak, not seen again." When interviewed in her old age, Sarah could recall only a thin wooden cross and the fleeting sight of two pale girls hovering at an upstairs window as she departed. More fragments followed. In the winter of 1905, County Coroner John Hensley investigated the shallow burial of an infant discovered by hunters near the ridge. His report, preserved in courthouse files, describes a child of defective formation bones. Frail features, irregular. Though no charges were ever brought, the case was quietly filed under unknown parentage. But locals whispered the truth. The sisters themselves seemed to fade into shadows. Those few who glimpsed them spoke of girls whose resemblance to one another grew ever more uncanny. Their figures thin, their complexions wan. They spoke to no one. In a community that measured time by weddings, baptisms and harvests, the Dowell daughters marked no such milestones. Their lives were lived behind shuttered windows, and when they emerged at all, it was only as rumor. It is from these fragments the school rolls that ended too soon the parish books gone silent. The midwife's penciled note, the coroner's careful phrasing, that later historians pieced together the earliest signs of what the Dowells concealed. The sisters withdrawn from society were not merely absent. They were hidden for a reason, and the evidence left in their wake pointed toward children born of blood, two close children whose brief lives bore witness to the inbreeding that had already begun within those shuttered walls. By the summer of 1906, the Dowell household had become a source of quiet fascination and unease in Taney County. Farmers driving their wagons along the ridge road claimed they sometimes heard cries in the night, not the cries of joy or grief that carry freely across valleys, but sounds muffled, pained, and quickly silenced. The Springfield Daily Leader ran a brief notice of disturbances reported near the Dowell farm, but the matter faded from print without explanation. In a community bound as much by silence as by law, rumors were left to circle only among neighbors and to grow darker with every telling. The strongest whispers were always about the children, or rather, the faint traces of them. According to a deposition still preserved in the county archives, a hunter stumbled upon a small grave near a creek bed in 1906. The coroner was summoned, and his notes described the remains of a young infant, features markedly irregular, a body terribly frail. No parents ever stepped forward. The burial was recorded only as paupers, but in town everyone assumed where the child had come from. No one spoke openly, yet travelers along the ridge road began to move with quiet unease. Midwives carried memories they dared not share. One of them, Anna Blevins, later confided to her granddaughter, who passed the story on in a 1940s oral history. Anna recalled being summoned twice to the Dowell place, only to be turned away at the door by Elias himself. Through the slats of a shutter, she saw a pale girl, watching her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she longed to call for help, but could not. Blevins wrote nothing down, fearing reprisal in a county where silence was stronger than law. But her whispered memory confirmed what others already suspected. Children were being born on the ridge, and those children did not survive. The rumors hardened into quiet conviction. Poorhouse records from neighboring Greene County began to list unclaimed infants of defective constitution taken in by Tenney physicians. The language of the time was restrained, but chilling weak-minded hydrocephalic of irregular lineage. These were the words chosen when no polite explanation could be offered. In one ledger, a single physician abandoned euphemism and wrote what others would not, inbred stock beyond saving. Still no sheriff came knocking. No judge convened a hearing. In an era when family honor stood above evidence, even the most grotesque suspicions dissolved into silence. The Dowells remained behind their shutters, and the sisters bore the weight of rumors they neither confirmed nor denied. For the townspeople, the story of the ridge became a cautionary murmur, traded in quiet kitchens after supper. A tale of daughters bound too tightly to their father of infants, who entered the world already broken of a household where grief had curdled into something unspeakable. For later investigators, this was the period when silence began to crack. The moment when the Dowell tragedy stopped being invisible and instead became the subject of fearful, half-spoken words that always ended the same way the most inbred children this county ever saw. The first official traces of what had long been whispered did not appear in newspapers, but in the margins of medical ledgers. In the spring of 1907, Dr. Samuel Whitaker of Springfield recorded in his casebook a visit from a girl of unusual pallor brought under cover of night. He did not name her, but his description resides in Tenney Hills. Father present, no husband mentioned, left little doubt to later readers. The patient delivered a frail infant who did not survive the week. Whitaker's handwriting grows faint at the entry's end, as though even his pen hesitated to mark the matter further. Other physicians followed. Dr. Alden of Branson noted a series of consultations between 1908 and 1910, each involving a young woman from Dillwell Ridge. His notes speak in the cool vocabulary of medicine, hydrocephalus, limb, malformation, weakness of constitution. Though names are absent, the pattern is unmistakable. Each visit arranged by the father Elias. Each daughter voiceless. The almshouse ledgers tell the rest. Beginning in 1909, the Greene County Poor Farm admitted 3 infants described simply as of defective stock. 2 died before their first birthday. The third entered only as Mary, no surname, lived until age 4. Her condition was recorded as incurable. The matron of the poor farm, interviewed years later, recalled the child's face as strangely alike to both sisters, yet aged before its time, as if generations of wear were written into features barely formed. By this period, the words that neighbors had whispered in bread-scented kitchens had taken on the hard weight of documents. Coroners, doctors, and almshouse matrons, each writing within the cautious conventions of their day, circled the truth without daring to name it. Their careful phrases, unwholesome parentage, unnatural consanguinity, stand now as thin veils over what the community knew but would not confront. And behind the veils, the Ridge House remained. Its shutters closed, its secrets intact, waiting for the night when silence could no longer hold. The children themselves carried the proof. Decades later, in statements gathered from aging neighbors and hunters who still walked the ridge, a pattern emerged. Tiny graves were said to dot the fields near the Dowell farm, unmarked and quickly covered. One hunter claimed he found 2 low mounds by the tree line, before Elias appeared with a rifle and forced him off the property. The graves were never exhumed. Yet in Ozark tradition, the sight of earth disturbed was evidence enough. By then, no one doubted that the Dowell sisters had borne children not once, but many times, and that each infant bore the unmistakable imprint of blood that should never have been joined. From this chapter forward, the story ceases to be mere rumor. It becomes a tragedy measurable in births and deaths, in ledger entries and coroner's notes. Every line of ink, restrained, euphemistic, clinical, marks the slow accumulation of horror. The Dowell sisters, bound to their father in silence, had become the mothers of what later investigators would describe, with devastating simplicity, the most inbred children ever recorded in Tenney County. In the autumn of 1911, the shuttered household was finally pierced by an outsider. According to minutes preserved in the archives of the Missouri Baptist Association, a traveling preacher named Reverend Silas Hargrove accepted an invitation to stay overnight at the Dowell farm while passing through the Ridge country. His written account, later submitted as part of a sworn affidavit, describes a house stifled by secrecy daughters, pale and withdrawn children, faint of breath and seldom heard. Hargrove wrote that he was offered a straw bed in the loft but could not sleep. From the dark below came the soft cries of an infant, followed by the low, commanding voice of Elias. The preacher glimpsed 2 young women moving silently through the house, their faces strikingly similar. Their demeanor subdued, as though they had learned that silence was the only safe language. At dawn, Hargrove confronted Elias, asking about the children. Elias replied only, "The Lord chastens whom he will. These are mine to bear." Disturbed, the preacher left the ridge and rode directly to Forsyth, where he filed a statement with Sheriff William Jennings. His words, recorded in the sheriff's logbook, accused Elias of keeping his daughters in unnatural relation and producing offspring unfit for life. It was the first time such allegations reached the hands of law enforcement. But Missouri law in 1911 recognized incest as a crime only when backed by confession or direct testimony. The sisters, when questioned, said nothing. Witnesses could offer only rumor. Even the preacher's affidavit, striking as it was, amounted to hearsay in a courtroom. The sheriff entered the complaint into the record, but did not proceed with charges. His final note in the log reads, "Without testimony, case cannot stand." Family returned to Ridge. Newspapers carried only the faintest echo. The Springfield Daily Leader of November 1911 printed a 2-sentence notice. Allegations of unwholesome practices have been raised concerning a family in Tenney County. Officials report investigation concluded without action. Behind those brief lines lay an unspoken truth. Everyone knew which family was meant. but no editor dared print the name. For a brief moment, the veil had lifted, a preacher had spoken, a sheriff had listened, and the possibility of intervention glimmered. But when the sisters remained silent, the veil fell once more. The Dowell household, bruised but untouched, returned to its shuttered isolation. And behind those shutters, more children were born, each bearing the unmistakable signs of a lineage turned inward, each deepening the tragedy that silence had allowed to grow unchecked. The complaint lodged by Reverend Hargrove in 1911 remains today as a solitary entry in the sheriff's ledger, a spark that might have kindled justice, but instead guttered into darkness. When the Taney County grand jury convened the following spring, no witnesses appeared. The sisters brought before the magistrate lowered their eyes and answered only in monosyllables. To every question, had children been born? Had their father stood in unnatural relation to them? They offered the same reply. No word to give. Without testimony, the case dissolved. Court clerks marked the file unproven and shelved it. Years later, when historians sought those papers, they found only fragments. Much of the record was lost in the courthouse fire of 1916, an inferno that consumed thousands of pages, and with them the official memory of the Dowell affair. What survived were stray notes, a half-burned affidavit, a sheriff's margin, scribbled the charred cover of a folder labeled Dowell Matter, unsubstantiated. Enough perhaps to confirm what the people of the Ridge already knew, and what they had always been too frightened or too proud to say aloud. The law had no purchase against silence. Missouri statutes of the early 1900s demanded confession, clear testimony, or irrefutable physical proof, none of which the Dowell case could produce. The sisters' silence became their father's shield. With the burden of evidence impossibly high, the matter collapsed before it could ever stand in open court. For the community, this failure was a lesson in caution rather than courage. Neighbors who once whispered behind drawn curtains now shut their mouths, entirely fearing reprisal or the stain of scandal. The preacher who had dared to raise the alarm left the county within the year. The sheriff, pressed by other duties and stymied by law, let the matter drop. By the close of 1912, the Dowell family had slipped back into obscurity. Their farm was once again shuttered, their secrets untouched. Yet, the children told a story the courts refused to hear. Registers from almshouses in Greene and Christian counties continued to list infants of irregular constitution taken in during those silent years. One entry dated 1913 describes, "Child blind from birth frame, weakened, no known parentage brought from Tenny Ridge." Another ledger the following year reads simply, "Male child suspected consanguinity, deceased after 2 months." These spare notations, clinical, unembellished, were the real testimony. Silent infants carrying the evidence in their very bodies. The Dowell affair never summoned a jury, never filled the courtroom benches with curious onlookers. Instead, it smoldered in rumor, in half-burned records, and in the quiet graves of children who bore the burden of a lineage turned inward. The law closed its eyes, and in that closing, allowed the story to continue. By the second decade of the 20th century, the traces of the Dowell tragedy no longer appeared only in whispers or affidavits. They were etched into the ledgers of almshouses, hospitals, and county relief boards, records that spoke with a quiet but undeniable voice. Beginning in 1913, entries from the Greene County Poor Farm describe a procession of children brought in from Teeny Ridge. Their parentage is listed as unknown, though everyone understood the truth. One ledger records a girl perhaps 3 years old, admitted with spinal curvature and a frail constitution. Another, a boy taken in the following year, is described as hydrocephalic blind, not expected to live. The matron of the almshouse, interviewed in the 1930s, recalled them vividly. They bore the look of kin, too close, she said, faces eerily alike, and yet aged before their time. Most died before their 5th year, their names erased from memory save for those few lines of ink. Medical reports, when they surface, speak with clinical restraint, but leave no doubt. A Springfield physician noted in 1915 infant, born of consanguineous stock deformities, extensive survival unlikely. County burial registers from the same period show small graves, marked only with initials or not at all, often recorded under the bureaucratic phrase pauper's interment. To later historians, the accumulation of these records painted a grim portrait. Generation after generation of children born, broken. Their suffering became the truest evidence of the Dowell family's hidden practices. Locals who once whispered cautiously began referring to them as the cursed brood. Hunters claimed to find tiny mounds of freshly turned earth near the ridge, hastily covered. Travelers along the creek road reported seeing Elias himself carrying bundles into the woods at night. No proof was ever offered, but the rumors hardened into legend. The Dowell name, once merely peculiar, became synonymous with horror. For the sisters, there is little record beyond absence. They remained cloistered, their lives measured only by the children they bore and buried. Census takers in 1920 listed Elias as still head of household. His daughters, still under his roof, no mention of grandchildren. The official silence stood in stark contrast to the unofficial truth that the Dowell homestead had produced what county officials privately called the most inbred children ever seen in these hills. What the law had failed to expose the children themselves revealed. Their frail bodies, their short lives, and the paper trails they left in almshouse logs and burial registers testified to a reality no courtroom had ever faced. And though most of their names are lost, their presence lingers in archival fragments, haunting reminders of what silence allowed to grow unchecked. By the 1930s, the Dowell name had nearly vanished from everyday speech in Tenney County. Yet, in the quiet corners of county archives in brittle ledgers and fading ink, the story remains, waiting for anyone willing to read what the living refused to say. The farm had fallen into ruin. Elias was long dead. The sisters, unrecorded in any parish, absent from every census, had vanished as if the earth itself had drawn them down. And yet, the story did not remain buried. It was resurrected not by living memory, but by the patient work of archivists and local historians, those quiet hunters of forgotten truths. At the Teeny County Courthouse, a clerk cataloging water-damaged papers uncovered a half-burnt sheriff's log from 1911. The surviving pages bore a single name, Dowell, and beside it, a single phrase, unnatural relation, no testimony. Around the same time, a graduate student at Drury College, combing through poorhouse registers, noticed a pattern. Repeated notations of defective stock and consanguineous parentage linked to children admitted from the ridge. When he traced the records backward, every path returned to the same family. Letters surfaced as well. In 1934, the Missouri Historical Society acquired a bundle of correspondence from Reverend Silas Hargrove, the traveling preacher who had once lodged at the Dowell home. In a letter to a fellow minister, Hargrove wrote of sisters bound by grief and by something darker, children marked with the curse of their father's blood. Though couched in biblical language, the meaning was unmistakable. These fragments set in motion a wave of retrospective research. Oral historians sought out elderly residents who still recalled the whispers of their youth. The pale girls at the shuttered windows, the tiny graves in the woods, the word inbred spoken in hushed tones around kitchen tables. Decades had passed, yet the memories still carried weight. When combined with the surviving documents, these recollections formed a narrative more complete than any trial ever recorded. What emerged was not a tale of sudden violence, but of gradual hidden decay. A household that turned inward, producing generation upon generation of children whose suffering embodied the price of silence. The Dowell sisters, once little more than shadows at their father's side, were now remembered as the mothers of what scholars and locals alike began to call the most inbred children in Ozark history. Through these archival resurrections, the story gained a permanence it had never possessed in life. What had once been rumor became evidence layered across coroner's notes, poorhouse ledgers, and yellowed letters. And though the Dowell farm itself had long since collapsed into dust and weeds, the documents ensured that the family's silence would never again erase their history. When the last fragments were gathered, a somber truth emerged. This was not merely the story of a family's misfortune, but of a community's complicity. Margaret's death in 1897 had closed the shutters on the Ridge house. But it was the years that followed, the years of secrecy of neighbors who looked away, of officials who demanded testimony that would never come, that allowed the Dowell tragedy to unfold unchecked. The children's brief lives measured in frailty, and early graves became the true testimony. Their presence in almshouse ledgers, their descriptions in physicians' notes, and their absence from parish records all pointed toward the same grim reality. Inbreeding had not been a single accident, but a pattern repeated and concealed until it etched itself into the very bodies of those born within that house. They became, as later historians called them, the most inbred children ever recorded in Tenney County. A phrase as stark as it is inadequate to capture the human suffering behind it. For the sisters themselves, the record remains nearly blank. They surface only in census rolls as women who never married, who never left the Ridge, who bore children that rarely lived to adulthood. Their silence, whether chosen or imposed, shielded their father and preserved the secrecy of the homestead. When at last they passed from the record, no obituary marked their names. Their graves, if they were marked at all, have long since been lost to weeds and time. Yet, the story endured. In the 1930s, when archivists unearthed the preacher's affidavit, the coroner's reports, and the poorhouse ledgers, the Dowell name became once more a byword for horror. Not the sensational horror of sudden violence, but the slow, suffocating horror of lives confined, of children born, broken of truths buried until the paper trail forced them into the light. Today, the Ridge stands empty. Its fields are overgrown with brush, the farmhouse collapsed into rot. But the documents remain, the sheriff's notes, the medical case books, the brittle oral testimonies of neighbors long gone. They remind us of what can happen when grief hardens into secrecy, when silence becomes a shield, and when a community chooses to look away. The Dowell story is in the end not just a tale of one family, but of a society's failure to confront what it could not bear to name. Its legacy lies in the lesson that silence does not erase truth. Truth waits in ledgers and diaries, in faded ink and brittle paper. And when it finally emerges as it did for the Dowells, it speaks with the full weight of the past. The Dowell sisters, their father, and the children who bore their blood remain present in history. Forgotten in life, they endure in record, a haunting reminder of how deeply inbreeding can scar a family and how silence can scar a community. And that is today's story. If you found this history as unsettling as we did, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Sleepy History Tales so you never miss the stories that refuse to stay buried.